Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. I want to welcome back to the program Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute. Trita, welcome back to the program.
Thanks so much for having me again.
So the Iranian presidential elections happen, and a reformist wins. Masoud, you're going to have to answer. Yes, thank you. How much of a surprise was this?
Well, first of all, the whole thing is a massive surprise because this was a snap election as a result of the previous president, Raisi, dying in that helicopter crash back in May. And, you know, they have snap elections. They allowed one reformist to run. Perhaps they were calculating that that reformist would not garner much support as the previous one didn't back in 2021. Hemati did not manage to generate any enthusiasm. The population overwhelmingly boycotted that election. They allowed this one to run. He did manage to garner some enthusiasm, although in the first round of the elections, participation was even lower than what it was in 2021. It hit 39-point-something%, which is the lowest that's ever happened. And it reflects how tremendously unhappy the population is in general with the situation in Iran and given up on the idea of change through the ballot box. But then he did manage to become one of the two top candidates, which meant that he goes on to the second round. And the person on the other side of the ballot is then Saeed Jalili, who is this ultra hardline conservative, which meant that people realized that they had already managed to send shockwaves to the regime by participating in extremely low levels, only 39% in the first round. But in the second round, it meant that if you don't participate, there's a likelihood that Saeed Jalili wins and you go back to essentially the Ahmadinejad years. And that seems to at least have been one of the factors, perhaps the most important factor that caused people to cast their ballots, still not at very high levels at all. It was only about 50%, which is low for Iranian standards, standard for American standards. But, you know, back in 2017, the participation rate was 73%. So this is a significant drop. And they elected him. He clearly got the majority of the votes. But everyone is very surprised because everyone had counted out the reformists. And there was this strongly held belief that the regime would never, ever again allow a reformist to be able to become president in the country.
How does, when we say the regime, maybe for us, outline for us the sort of the structure of the Iranian government so we understand, because it's almost like, I mean, I think there are some people who are surprised that that this could happen, that there would be another reformist in this instance, and don't fully have a sense of like where this. It's almost as if the Iranian people just elected a sort of a middle manager, or like you know, I don't know what the next step up is in the corporate structure, but not the boss, not the CEO, but like maybe somebody who has a portfolio.
I would say it goes beyond that. And it kind of comes to the question of how much power does the president of Iran actually have in that system? And I think that is a very legitimate question. But I think we should also recognize that question has been somewhat politicized in Washington, because it's a question that is very much on everyone's mind whenever there's a reformist who is the president. And then, you know, we hear all the time that, you know, the president doesn't matter, doesn't have any real influence. When Ahmadinejad was president, all the focus was on Ahmadinejad, and no one was saying, oh, the president of Iran does not matter. So you know, from certain quarters in Washington, it's a self-serving tool that is being used to kind of dismiss that there is someone there who actually, as part of his campaign platform, argued for improving relations with the West, getting sanctions lifted, engaging in direct dialogue with the United States. If you don't want that, if you're sitting in Washington and you prefer confrontation, then you're going to be hammering very hard on the note that, well, the president doesn't actually matter. But it is a legitimate question. I'll give you my best shot at explaining what it is. I think to a very large extent, I think it's important to recognize that in Iran, the institutions matter less than the personalities that are in those institutions. In the case of Raisi, for instance, I don't think he was a particularly important president because he didn't have the personality or the desire to make a mark of his own. He really wanted to just be the manager and the implementer of policies set by others. In the case of Ahmadinejad, it was quite the contrary. This was someone who was actually very much a hardliner, but also challenging a lot of the structures of the Iranian system from within, to the point in which he had a huge falling out with the supreme leader. Pezeshkian does not come across as someone who is going to try to really rock the boat. In fact, part of the reason why some people were not particularly excited about his candidacy is because he actually campaigned as someone who was loyal to the system rather than someone who wants to challenge the system. He did not run as an anti-establishment figure, which is really interesting. Almost all of the other reformists have run explicitly as being anti-establishment, which is part of the reason why they got a lot of votes, because people in Iran tend to vote anti-establishment. But he has not done that. Whether that is because that really reflects who he is, or whether that is a strategic calculation from his end in which he believed or calculated that if he actually did position himself as an anti-establishment person, perhaps the supreme leader and the IRGC would go to excessive lengths, including cheating, in order to make sure that he couldn't become president. Now, we won't know until he actually takes office and we get to see how exactly is he going to try to govern.
Let me just one more question. So when we describe him as a reformist, you can reform the structure of the government, or you can reform the set of policies that live within the structure of that government. What is his portfolio of policies? Because I've read some stuff from you where the Iranian Revolutionary Guard might have more control over what happens regionally in terms of do we provide funds or weapons to Hezbollah or to this group, the Kurds in northern Iraq, or something like that. But in terms of like, what is his portfolio? And I imagine that can be expanded and contracted based upon who the person serving there is. But what are the reformist policies that he is looking to implement? And you mentioned direct bilateral negotiations. What else?
So formally, foreign policy does fall under the purview of the president. The foreign minister is a cabinet member. Now, it is understood that informally, the foreign minister's position, as well as the defense minister's position, he will not put forward a name that is not approved by the supreme leader. But these are the informal rules. But formally, he is in charge of that. Informally, or in reality, Iran's regional policy, particularly when it comes to relationship with Hezbollah and the axis of resistance, is really in the hands of the IRGC. And at times, at significant loggerheads with the president. This was very visible during the Rouhani government. That does not mean, however, we should not overinterpret that. It does not mean necessarily that the reformists are against Hezbollah or believe that Iran should pursue a foreign policy in which it doesn't have a strong relationship with Hezbollah, doesn't support some of these Iraqi militias, etc. I think by and large, there isn't that much of a variation within the Iranian system. But the priority of it versus other strategies, a diplomatic strategy of opening with the West, etc., that's where it shifts. With someone like Pezeshkian as president, it means that there will be a different voice at the table. That table is not one that he completely controls, even though he's the president. His voice may not be the most important one at that table, but that voice will be at the table, whereas that wasn't the case just a couple of months ago, in which the reformists essentially were completely shut out from the system and the conversation.
Sam actually asked the question that I was thinking of, what those reforms entail, but I'm wondering if you could even elaborate further on that, because low turnout, as you mentioned, was a big part of the equation. how much democratic legitimacy does, and I can't pronounce the last name, if you could say it again, Pezeshkian have, and even though, I mean, the fact that he beat this hardliner and he has more kind of liberal mindset about, say, women in the country of Iran versus how the hardliner was presenting himself in the campaign, that seems like a good thing, but the fact that it was record low turnout also should be an indicator, if you could just square that for our audience.
Absolutely. And what is fascinating here is that when you have really low turnout, usually that has meant that it has favored the conservatives because their own base tended to have a much, much more disciplined voting record. They always voted. This time around, the turnout was really low, lower than it has ever been. Well, not compared to 4 years ago, at least in the second round. But the Reformist actually won. And part of the reason for that is that there is a huge difference and conflict within the conservative camp. And many of the supporters of Ghalibaf, who was the conservative speaker of the parliament, appear to have shifted to Pezeshkian's side, including some of Ghalibaf's senior advisors who publicly threw their weight behind Pezeshkian rather than Jalili. So as the hardliners essentially were somewhat successful in purging the system and kicking out all the reformists and having everything control of by themselves, the very inevitable thing then immediately happened. The hardliners started fighting with each other and devolved into new factions. On the question of legitimacy, I think this is a very important question. It goes back to, what exactly is he trying to reform? Is he trying to reform the system in order to make sure that the system is no longer Islamic Republic, or reform some of its policies? Here, I think there's a difference between some of the reformers, and there's a difference between the actual politicians and the people who are voting for them. I think a very large number of people who voted for reformists, at least in the past, did so because they believed that the reforms that they were going to implement, whether they intended for it or not, eventually would lead to the collapse of the system and a different government, but under controlled circumstances. It would not lead to an uncontrolled revolution in which you would no longer be able to know what comes after the collapse. This would essentially be a reform of the system until it is unrecognizable. I think a lot of people who voted for reform were thinking that, even though the reformers may not have used that language, because if they did, they would immediately be branded as anti-revolutionaries and purged from the system. This time around, I'm not so sure that that was necessarily the thinking. To a large extent, I think a lot of folks went out and voted because the alternative was so much worse. And because they believe that their situation is so bad, economic situation is so bad, they just needed a little bit of a respite. They needed something that makes the economic situation slightly better, rather than thinking that this is a first step towards a longer process that gets rid of the regime as a whole. Many of those who were in that camp probably are the ones that didn't vote at all. They also want change, but they want much more far-reaching change and much more sooner and quicker, and no longer have a faith that it can come through the electoral system.
Do we have a sense of what the sense of the Iranian people is in regards to why the economy is so bad? Is it, I mean, is it as straightforward as we don't have any type of decent relations with the West and we're still being sanctioned, or is it, are there other factors?
So this is a question that in the US government has been important, because they wanted to make sure that the blame for the negative situation in the country primarily falls on the regime itself. I think for folks inside the country, it's actually much easier. It's not a lot about that. It's the fact that they know this is a corrupt government. Corruption is widespread. This is an incompetent government. Mismanagement is massive. But it is also because of sanctions. Now, some people may put sanctions as being 50%, others may put it at 70%, but all of these three factors are undeniably part of the reason why the economic situation in Iran is very bad. Now, during the last couple of years under the Raisi government, the strategy was not even to try to get sanctions lifted. They no longer had faith that the United States is capable of prolonged sanctions relief. That is not it's not difficult to understand why they concluded that, because at the end of the day, the Iranians signed on to the JCPOA, they lived up to the JCPOA, and it was the United States under Trump that only 2 years after the deal had been struck, withdrew from the agreement. So essentially, they have a very cynical view of US political system, and they believe that as a result, Iran can never count on sanctions being lifted by the US for long periods of time. So they shifted their strategy to what they called sanctions neutralization. Instead of seeking to have trade with the West, they were going to really dig down on trading with their regional neighbors and trade as much as possible in currencies that are not the dollar. And by that, neutralize sanctions. To a certain extent, that has been successful, but it's failed on one very crucial point. Absent sanctions relief, they're still not getting investments from China and others who are perhaps willing to invest in Iran, but can't do so because of the US sanctions. And without investment, they're not going to be able to have a good economic situation. They may be able to grow a little bit, but over a long period of time, it's going to be devastating for the economy. So Pezeshkian's argument was that they need to talk directly with the US, they need to get sanctions lifted, because otherwise Iran will never live up to its full potential, absent the investments that can come into the country once the US and Iran have kind of resolved enough of their issues to have a certain degree of sanctions lifted.
I know you just have time for one more quick question. We've spoken in the past about Biden's policy in regards to Israel and what's happened in Gaza and happening in Gaza. We have also spoken with you in the past about that JPCOA or the nuke deal. Thank you. Has your opinion as to why Biden failed to close that deal early on in his administration, as everyone assumed he would, to get back on track, has your interpretation, your understanding of why he failed to do that changed in light of how aggressive he's been and willing to support Israel's actions in Gaza? In other words, is it possible that that was never really his intention, or that that dynamics with Israel inhibited him from making that nuke deal?
I don't think it's the dynamic that prevented it. It's the fact that and I think Gaza has really enforced this. Biden really did not want to have any confrontation with any Israeli prime minister. This was critical. Their conclusion of the JCPOA was that while it was a good deal, it was too costly because of what Netanyahu did to hurt Obama in the elections. And as a result, if they were going to do the JCPOA, they had to go the extra 500,000 gazillion miles to make sure that the Israelis would be happy with it. That was the sense that I got at least a year into the Biden administration. And I think what we've seen over Gaza just reinforces that is really a crucial central organizing principle for this president. And I think it is really, really bad for the United States, because it would have been much, much better if he had just gone in for a variety of reasons, including, I would add, that I'm very convinced that the Iranians would not be supporting Russia in Ukraine in the manner that they're doing today had there been a JCPOA in effect, because the Iranians would have something to lose. Now they have nothing to lose, because all of these sanctions have just completely cut Iran off from the West. And I think there's another thing that happened here that further reinforces this. I don't know if you saw the press conference yesterday when Kirby was asked as to whether the Biden administration thinks that perhaps there's an opening now with Pezeshkian coming into office saying that he wants to have direct talks with the US. And he flat out rejected it. And on top of that, he said that part of the reason we're not going to have that diplomacy is because what the Iranians are doing with Hezbollah and support for militias in the region, regional policies, Ukraine, etc. So essentially, he used the US's many conflicts with Iran as a justification for not pursuing diplomacy. Remember the last president that used that logic?
That's the right wing. Yeah, that was the right wing talking points. That was exactly. McCain and so Graham and all
doing that.
Yep.
Now, I mean, they're pursuing the same policy. Abraham Accords. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps this is not ultimately their policy, but they're using the language and the logic of the neoconservative policy, which just further closes the political space they have to pursue diplomacy if that actually is their real policy.
Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute. Thanks so much. Really appreciate your giving us insight into all of this. Thanks
so
again.
Trita.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.